On Sunday evening, March 31st, President Lyndon Johnson delivered a radio and television address to the American people. The early substance of his speech concerned the bombing of North Vietnam.
Tonight, I renew the offer I made last August to stop the bombardment of North Vietnam. We ask that talks begin promptly, that they be serious talks on the substance of peace. Tonight, I have ordered our aircraft and our naval vessels to make no attacks on North Vietnam, except in the area north of the demilitarized zone where the continuing enemy buildup directly threatens Allied forward positions, and where the movement...
And so, with the decision about the bombing made public, the President turned his attention to domestic affairs. Almost casually, he set the stage for one of the most startling and unexpected announcements ever made by an American president.
With American sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. But let men everywhere know, however, that a strong and a confident and a vigilant America stands ready tonight to seek an honorable peace and stands ready tonight to defend an honored cause, whatever the price, whatever the burden, whatever the sacrifice that duty may require. Thank you for listening. Good night, and God bless all of you.
Moments later, President Johnson held a press conference in the Yellow Oval Room. How did he feel now that he had made the announcement? Good, considering all that he had gone through during the past 24 hours. Now, all of his energies and efforts could be directed toward a peaceful settlement of the war in Vietnam. The following morning, while a stunned world was still measuring the seismic impact of his decision, the president flew to Chicago to address the National Association of Broadcasters. Mayor Richard Daley was on hand to meet him at O'Hare Airport.
One of my aides said this morning, things are really getting confused around Washington, Mr. President. And I said, how's that? Said, looks to me like that you're going to the wrong convention in Chicago.
Although he would speak with humor and poignancy about his decision of the night before and his own shortcomings as a communicator, the major theme of his speech was national unity.
Sometimes I have been called a seeker of consensus. More often that has been criticism of my actions instead of praise of them. But I have never denied it, because to heal and to build support, to hold people together is something I think that is worthy, and I believe it is a noble task.
And so on the afternoon of the first day in April, President Johnson found himself freed of his political restraints. Hopefully, his gesture of March 31st had cleared the way for a change in the course of the war in Vietnam. On April 3rd, some 60 hours after the president's Sunday evening address, Radio Hanoi issued a 1,000-word broadcast of its own. It was confident, boastful, and bristling with the usual hardline cliches. But buried in the rhetoric was one significant paragraph, and that paragraph electrified the free world and gave the United States its first real diplomatic breakthrough of the war. Hanoi, it said, was ready to meet with United States representatives to discuss the cessation of U.S. bombing raids and all other acts of war. Perhaps the sudden willingness of the North Vietnamese to talk was a tactical maneuver, a probe costing them nothing. Perhaps it was a test of settlement terms, or simply a counter-move to avoid losing a propaganda round. Whatever it was, the potential for ending the long diplomatic stalemate was suddenly there. After an intensive round of consultations with some of his closest advisors, President Johnson made a prompt and affirmative reply.
Accordingly, we will establish contact with the representatives of North Vietnam. Consultations with the government of South Vietnam and our other allies are now taking place.
Despite the crucial mid-morning activity surrounding the Hanoi broadcast, President Johnson took time to honor a prior request by Senator Robert Kennedy that the two men meet to discuss problems of national unity. This meeting, the last that they would ever hold, took an hour. Among the items discussed was the Hanoi proposal. 2 months and 3 days later, while seeking the nomination of his party for the presidency, Senator Kennedy would die at the hands of an assassin in the city of Los Angeles. Following the meeting with Senator Kennedy, President Johnson held a second hour-long session in the cabinet room. This one with Vice President Hubert Humphrey, just back from a diplomatic mission to Mexico City. On Saturday, April 27th, the Vice President would join Senators Kennedy and McCarthy as a declared candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination. On Thursday, April 4th, President Johnson and his daughter Lucy flew to New York City to witness installation of the Most Reverend Terence J. Cook as the new Archbishop of St. Patrick's Cathedral. Two hours later, with his helicopter warmed up and waiting for the takeoff to Kennedy International, the president decided on a second stop. Within minutes, his motorcade was moving through Manhattan's crowded East Side toward the UN Plaza and a 70-minute meeting with UN Secretary General U Thant. Just before 6 p.m., Air Force One took off from Kennedy International Airport and headed for home. By morning, the big jet would be on the first leg of the president's trip to Hawaii. But then, at 8:05 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the country was stunned by the tragic news out of Memphis, Tennessee. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Negro apostle of nonviolence, had been shot and killed by an assassin. Throughout the evening and into the following 2 days and nights, a shock wave of looting and arson would sweep through a number of cities and towns from coast to coast, including Washington, D.C. In the immediate aftermath of Dr. King's death, President Johnson canceled his trip to Hawaii and spoke to the American people on radio and television, asking them to reject the kind of blind violence that had caused the Negro leader's death. On the following morning, he met with a large group of prominent and influential Americans, black and white, to see what could be done about stemming the apparent tide of violence in the cities. Among those attending the conference were Mayor Walter Washington of the District of Columbia, Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, Vice President Humphrey, Senate Democratic leader Mike Mansfield, the Reverend Walter Fauntleroy of Washington's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Whitney Young, Director of the National Urban League, Speaker of the House John McCormick, Roy Wilkins, Executive Director of the NAACP, and Bayard Rustin, Chief Planner of the 1963 March on Washington. There had been few weeks like it in American history. A president had stepped out of the political arena in an election year. Then came the hope and elation over the promise of a new peace offensive. And now, just as suddenly, a great Negro leader was dead, and there was sorrow and despair over the burning and looting in the streets.
Once again, the heart of America is heavy for a tragedy that denies the very meaning of our land. The life of a man who symbolized the freedom and faith of America has been taken. But it is the fiber and the fabric of the republic that's being tested. And no words of mine can fill the void of the eloquent voice that has been stilled. But this I do believe deeply. The dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has not died with him. Men who are white, men who are black, must and will now join together as never in the past to let all the forces of divisiveness know that America shall not be ruled by the bullet, but only by the ballot of free and of just men.
By Friday evening, the first of over 11,000 regular Army and National Guard troops that would occupy the capital city until mid-month had taken up positions in and around the riot area. Perhaps the country's viewpoint on the fires and rioting was most eloquently expressed by Mrs. Johnson during her 5-day tour through the state of Texas with 38 European journalists. The journalists were from 13 different European countries and had been invited to this country as part of a Discover America tour.
Our visitors have come at a time of anguish and turmoil in our country. They saw our frictions laid bare, but I believe that they have also seen that the crashing headlines which shook us as much as they did the world are not all the story of this country. They do not blot out the progress that has been made across this great democracy. Behind the smoke of our troubled cities, There is a great wide land of strength and confidence and warmth. Our tears for our country's troubles are deep, but deeper still is our confidence in the future and our ability to meet and master man's basic problem, how to live in peace.
On Saturday the 6th, General William Westmoreland, commander of the U.S. forces in Southeast Asia, arrived at the White House for 2 days of talks with President Johnson. On their agenda were discussions on the progress of the war in South Vietnam, the selection of military advisors to accompany the American delegation to the talks with the North Vietnamese, and the appointment of his successor after General Westmoreland assumed his new position as Army Chief of Staff. By far the most significant news out of Vietnam during the general's stay was the word about Operation Pegasus. As suddenly as it had begun, the siege of Khe Sanh was over. On April 5th, the combined drive by U.S. and South Vietnamese forces had cleared Highway 9 and opened the major ground supply route to the embattled Marines, who had held it for over 76 days. On Monday of the following week, President Johnson received an official message from Hanoi, repeating in formal terms its previous statement agreeing to meet with American diplomatic representatives. Coincidentally, the president had already made arrangements for an evening flight to Camp David, where he planned to conduct a broad review of the war in Vietnam. Early the following morning, Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker arrived from South Vietnam. He had been joined on the last leg of his journey to Camp David by Secretary of State Rusk, Secretary of Defense Clifford, and General Earl Wheeler, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In his original reply to the Hanoi broadcast, President Johnson had proposed Geneva as a meeting site for the negotiating teams, and stated that Ambassador Averell Harriman was immediately available as the U.S. representative for initial contacts. The agreement to meet could develop into a settlement, but the chance also carried with it a risk that couldn't be ignored. If the talks failed to bring an acceptable accommodation, the war could rage even more fiercely than before. So the immediate problem for the United States and its allies was to be sure that the site for talks was mutually acceptable to both sides, and that we were dealing from a position of strength. President Johnson asked Ambassador Bunker for his personal evaluation of the progress of the war in Vietnam.
If Tet was psychological and political success abroad, it certainly was a resounding military defeat for them in Vietnam. The Vietnamese forces, for example, many of them were only at half strength. They inflicted very heavy casualties and drove the communists from every city in the country. The government did not collapse, but turned to with great will and determination. The armed forces did not defect. The people, after the initial shock, emerged strengthened in their anger and their hatred for communists and their determination to resist.
On Wednesday, April 10th, President and Mrs. Johnson welcomed Chancellor and Mrs. Joseph Klaus of Austria to Washington.
Mr. Chancellor and Mrs. Klaus, we welcome you to the beautiful Washington Spring, Mr. Chancellor, at a time of turbulence and hope in our nation. As it is for us here in America, so it is around the world. There is turbulence today in America and in Eastern Europe and in Southeast Asia, and there is hope as well in all of those places. So our aim at this season is to sift the hope from the turbulence, so hope may grow unfettered. Mr. Chancellor, the experience of your nation tells us that it can. You give us additional cause to believe that hope can coexist with turbulence, and that freedom and order will, in time, prevail. We expect this spring day in Washington that this will happen in our country, in America, and that it will happen in Southeast Asia, and will happen wherever men of goodwill earnestly seek and pursue peace and equity and justice for all.
Even while President Johnson talked to Chancellor Klaus about America's responsibility in a time of crisis and challenge, word came from Capitol Hill that Congress had passed and sent to the White House the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Included in the measure was a landmark open housing bill, which, when fully effective, would forbid discrimination in approximately 80% of all housing offered for rent or for sale in the United States.
I do not exaggerate when I say that the proudest moments of my presidency have been times such as this, when I have signed into law the promises of a century. I shall never forget that it is more than 100 years ago when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. But it was a proclamation, it was not a fact. And in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we affirmed through law that men equal under God are also equal when they seek a job, when they go to get a meal in a restaurant, or when they seek lodging for the night in any state in the Union. And now the Negro families no longer suffer the humiliation of being turned away because of their race. In the Civil Rights Act of 1965, we affirmed through law for every citizen in this land the most basic right of democracy, the right of a citizen to vote in an election in his country. In the 5 states where the act had its greater impact, Negro voter registration has already more than doubled. Now with this bill, the voice of justice speaks again. It proclaims that fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life. We all know that the roots of injustice run deep, but violence cannot redress a solitary wrong or remedy a single unfairness. And we just must put our shoulders together and put a stop to both. The time is here. Action must be now.
At mid-month, from all outward appearances, the city of Washington was returning to normal. Despite many problems, she seemed determined to weather the remaining days of April with a remarkable poise. On Saturday the 13th, President and Mrs. Johnson were at home in Texas for the Easter weekend. For the moment, all of the meetings and affairs of state were lost in a pleasant two-day montage of open fields, Texas sunshine, family and friends. As the smallest member of the Johnson family, little Lynn Nugent soon found out that Easter Sunday meant bunny rabbits, other children, a short but abortive walk with his grandmother, and a horseback ride, courtesy of his constant companion, the President of the United States. On Monday, April 15th, at 9:20 a.m., President Johnson left Bergstrom Air Force Base for Honolulu, Hawaii. Among those accompanying him were William Bundy, Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs, Presidential Troubleshooter Cyrus Vance, U.S. Protocol Chief Andrew Biddleduke, General Earl G. Wheeler, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Special Assistant Walt Rostow, and Ambassador Winthrop Brown, former U.S. Ambassador to Korea. During the 2 weeks following the President's speech of March 31st, the administration had officially proposed 5 neutral sites for possible peace talks: Switzerland, Vientiane, Rangoon, Jakarta, and New Delhi. Hanoi had rejected them all, insisting instead that the United States choose either Phnom Penh or Warsaw. Coupled with this was the matter of reassuring allies like President Chung-hee Park that the United States intended to remain steadfast in its commitments in Asia. The presidential party arrived at Honolulu's International Airport just after 1 p.m. local time. Among those on hand to meet the president were Governor John Burns and Pacific Commander Admiral Grant Sharp, Jr.
Our ties across the Pacific go back a long way, at least a century and a quarter to the time when we became involved in China, and then a little later in Japan. But it is only in the past 27 years that we have learned that the destiny of the United States is once and for all bound up with the fate of the peoples of Asia and the Pacific. I deeply believe that this nation will continue to play its part in helping to protect and to develop the new Asia. I deeply believe that my successor, whoever he may be, will act in ways that will reflect America's abiding interest in Asians' freedom and in Asia's security.
On Wednesday, the 14th, President Johnson and South Korean President Chung-hee Park met at the oceanfront estate of the late industrialist Henry J. Kaiser. Their one-day meeting had a packed agenda, which ranged from the war in Vietnam to the North Korean seizure of the USS Pueblo during the month of January.
The days are long gone when Americans could say that Asians are not our kind of people. People who love peace and freedom, whatever their color or their religion or their national origin, are our kind of people. We wish to see Asia, like Europe, take an increasing responsibility for shaping its own destiny. And we intend and we mean to help it do so. America will remain the friend and the ally and the partner of Europe. But America will also remain the friend and the ally and the partner of free men in Asia. And this is my faith. This is my belief. This is my judgment.
On Thursday morning, April 18th, President Johnson landed at California's March Air Force Base for a conference on Asian affairs with former President Eisenhower. After the meeting between President Johnson and General Eisenhower ended, the administration announced that it had prepared a list of 10 more possible sites for diplomatic contacts with North Vietnam, 6 in Asia and 4 in Europe. It was time for the communists to give a prompt and serious answer to the question of meeting sites. The journey to Hawaii ended where it had begun, at the LBJ Ranch in Texas. With his announcement on the night of March 31st, it seemed inevitable that friends and critics alike would take a searching second look at the man in the White House. But because of the momentous happenings during the month of April, few would have the opportunity to study the events behind the major headlines. Events that would clearly reflect many of the accomplishments, hopes, and aspirations of the Johnson presidency. On the night of the 24th, President Johnson arrived at Chicago's Conrad Hilton Hotel to address a rally of Cook County Democrats. Their reception for him was spontaneous and deeply felt.
No man could serve where I have served now for more than 4 years and 5 long months without sensing that we are once again in a new time. There are young men and women wondering if there's a place for them in a world that they did not make. There are mothers and fathers who despise war as their children despise it. But the story of our land, the United States of America, is not a dismal story of wrongs without end. Here in America, as nowhere else since time began, we are striving eagerly to let the sunlight shine upon all of our people, because that is what America is all about. Step by step, year by year, we're moving out of the darkness and out of the shadows, out into a new day of light and justice for all of our people.
In 1937, President Johnson was a young congressman representing the 10th Congressional District in the state of Texas. During that year, Washington had only 60 foreign missions doing business in the nation's capital. In April of 1968, during the annual diplomatic reception, the number had grown to 117. Testimony not only to the speed of the jet age, but to a country's willingness to assume global responsibility during a time of explosive change. Under Mrs. Johnson's leadership, private donors had given nearly $3 million to make Washington a more pleasant and livable place. As a rallying cry, her efforts to help the District of Columbia had had a profound influence on planners and conservationists across the country. On April 17th, she invited the 200 private donors and the members of her Committee for a More Beautiful Capital to a White House luncheon and city tour. One of the guest speakers and one of Mrs. Johnson's staunchest allies in city beautification work was Mayor Walter Washington.
Her heritage as First Lady is not in beautification per se. It's in communication. It's in the hope and the desire to identify a human being with his environment. And this is really the heart of the turbulence and turmoil we're going through now. The extent to which people have been alienated from participation, alienated from the American dream, and I would like to think the days ahead are great days. I think this is significant for us, that if we touched one child alone in this great effort, I think it's important.
On April 22nd, President Johnson signed a bill which gave the citizens of the District of Columbia the right to elect their own school board. Overall, it had been a momentous year for the district.
We've installed a mayor and city council in the city hall. The new government is responding to the needs and the hopes of the people in day-to-day operations and in crisis as well. With this legislation, we will restore another basic right of popular government, the right of people to help shape the education of their children. Washington should become, in every sense, a model city. It must be a place where democracy is enshrined not only in monuments, but in the lives of its people. The people must be given the right to elect their own representatives in the Congress. The people must be given the most basic right of all, home rule. And someday they will be. Of that, I am sure.
As expected, April would have its moments of nostalgia. On the 18th, Mrs. Johnson celebrated the White House acquisition of a portrait of Mrs. Bess Truman. At the First Lady's side was Mrs. Margaret Truman Daniel. In the room, a host of old friends from the Truman administration. Another satisfying moment for the Johnsons during the month of April was the swearing-in ceremony for the new Postmaster General, Marvin Watson.
He has served here in the White House for more than 3 years. I have found him always cool in crisis, and we have had enough of them for me to test him. Marvin, we'll all miss you. We believe that our loss here will be the Post Office Department's gain. The presence of these people here is a sufficient testimony to your fairness and to your service and to the high esteem in which you're held in the government, particularly the executive and congressional branches.
This is a happy moment for me, too, because I know and trust Marvin and his family, and I believe in them. I wanted to ask all of you guests if you won't come to the next garden, the Jacqueline Kennedy Garden, where we'll all have an opportunity to visit with Marvin and Marion and their family and have some refreshments.
On the 26th, President Johnson met with the Board of Trustees from the new Urban Institute, a private, nonprofit corporation. The Institute was chartered at the President's request to launch a free and searching inquiry into the problems of decay and growth in the American city. On the international calendar, President Johnson asked Congress to approve a far-reaching plan to reform world finance. He called for the creation of a new form of international currency, special drawing rights or paper gold, to relieve drains on the U.S. gold supply and thus strengthen its position in world trade. Just as the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 prepared us for the post-World War II era of trade, this new step looked forward to the decades of the 1970s and 1980s.
The decisions that we must make this year are among the most vitally important decisions that Americans have ever been called upon to make. Perhaps more than at any time in all of your past, we shall be choosing our future, and we shall be choosing the future of our children. The test of our compassion will continue long after the ordeal of our great cities. The trial of our course and our wisdom will continue far beyond the terrible ordeal of Vietnam. Our politics today is changed, and it's changing. Our issues are new. Our styles are new. Our slogans are new. And all of this is good, for it reflects and it serves the changes that are being wrought by America's own advances in the world. But the purpose of our politics is not changed, and it must not change. For that purpose is to serve the unity of all of our people all the time. people have been asking us what we were going to do with our spare time. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going down to the ranch Monday afternoon, and I'm going to sit on that front porch in a rocking chair for about 10 minutes. And then I'm going to read a little and write a little. Then I'm going to put on my hat and go out and find Walter Lippmann. Someone told me the other day that the press had had a few complaints about the treatment that you'd received during this administration. Well, this is a fine time to be telling me now. Why didn't you mention it sooner? Well, I've got some complaints of my own. Maybe I should have mentioned them sooner to you. Getting misquoted, for instance, is one thing I've got to complain about. I remember that Peter Hurd painting. Do you all remember that? I never said it was ugly. Actually, I thought it was a pretty good likeness, except for one little detail. It left off the halo.
In January of 1969, President Lyndon Baines Johnson began his final 20 days as President of the United States.
The man who sits in this chair sits in the chair that's been occupied by less than 40 men in the long history of this great republic. He is selected by the will and by the votes of a majority of the citizens of this republic. He must execute the philosophy and the policies of the people of this nation, regardless of his own personal feelings from time to time. He is the executor of the will of the people of this nation, and he carries upon his shoulders day and night a burden that always seems, at least to him, too much to carry, but only for him to carry.
The transfer of presidential power is at best a very difficult procedure. Historian Henry Graff has referred to it as the stirring rite of political renewal. In the foreword to a book on chief executives, which was published in 1966, President Johnson wrote, "Each of our presidents owes something to his predecessors. They share much with one another, yet each is different in himself. Together they reflect and renew the great diversity that is the wellspring of America's enduring vitality." During the early days of the month, President Johnson held a continuing dialogue with his fiscal advisors on the progress of the budget report. As the official balance sheet of the nation's business, it held the key to the content and final delivery dates of the economic report and the State of the Union message.
The story of America on the road ahead was going to be told in the terms of how we face up to and master the threat of inflation while preserving prosperity. How we maintain the strength of the dollar that has been challenged and is being challenged throughout the world. How we assure that our environment is livable and pleasing, and whether we can really carry out our commitment to bring our bypassed citizens into the full life of the nation.
To help sustain the momentum of these commitments and restrain a booming economy, President Johnson decided to ask Congress for a full year's extension of the 10% surtax, due to expire during the coming June. Amidst all the pressing last-minute activity, the formal ceremonies and private farewells, Mrs. Johnson took time to personally supervise the packing and moving of many of her family's personal belongings from the White House living quarters. Among the items remaining behind were the official portraits of the President and First Lady. In the Executive Office building across the street, the files of the Johnson years in the capital city, numbering over 31 million items from the House, Senate, and presidential years, were packed and readied for shipment to the Lyndon Johnson Library at the University of Texas. When the final history of the Johnson administration is written, there's little doubt that many of the fascinating passages will deal with the war in South Vietnam and the protracted struggle over the peace table in Paris, a struggle that had dragged on into the month of January.
We want peace so much, we're working at it diligently and earnestly, but it is an elusive thing, and we have been unable to find the formula that would give us peace with honor in that area of the world and stop the killing, although we will continue to search to the very last moment when we leave this office. I think that's the biggest disappointment we've had.
The President of the United States of America, authorized by Act of Congress, has awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, 1st Oak Leaf Cluster, to General Earl G. Wheeler, United States Army, for exceptionally meritorious service in a duty of great responsibility. General Wheeler's deep professional competence.
The country's senior military spokesman during the war in Vietnam was General Earl G. Wheeler, who was now entering an unprecedented 5th year as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
And the United States of America.
His president's high regard for him has been forged in the fires of crisis and hardened in the day-to-day exercise of awesome responsibilities. His vision has been clear, and his counsel has been wise. He has served his nation with a soldier's skill and a patriot's devotion. The mark of that service is written large on the shield of America's defense: the might of its power, the effectiveness of its military forces, and the efficiency of their management. And for us all, the days of the future are brighter with the hope of peace, more confident of the preservation of freedom, safer with the assurance of our security, because Earl Wheeler was here when his country needed him. General, today, on behalf of the grateful people of America, I salute you.
As he neared the end of 5 years and 2 months in office, President Johnson could look back on other times, to other men, many of them good friends, and reflect with deep satisfaction on his administration's many legislative accomplishments. In domestic affairs, he had presided over a new age of progressivism. Much of the old agenda had reached fulfillment. Medicare had become an accepted part of American life. The voting booth and the doors to public service had been open to all Americans, regardless of their color. In a field where race, religion, and ideology had been formidable obstacles to progress, the Education Act of 1965 had cracked a constitutional and political impasse over church-school relationships and brought federal money directly to the slum areas where it was needed the most. Head Start, the Model Cities program, consumer protection, increased investment in manpower training, and the Housing Act of 1968 were a few of the many accomplishments of his years in the presidency. As a conservationist, President Johnson's record reflected his deep concern over the problems of a livable environment and the protection of our natural resources, a concern shared most notably by another member of the White House family.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. I'm so happy to welcome you here this afternoon. This is an occasion that fills me with warmth and nostalgia and a great deal of pleasure. As I look back on the parade of people and ideas and attainments that have been marked here in this room, I am aware of how often there have been occasions heralding strides in conservation. Some of the faces I see here today were at the White House Conference on Natural Beauty in May of 1965. So many events since then come to mind, from signing acts for the Land and Water Conservation Fund and the Highway Beautification Act, to launching the many new seashores and national parks like the Redwoods. Today, we are issuing 4 new postage stamps, messengers that will go to homes and offices all over the country. They will bring a reminder and my personal hope that Americans will intensify their commitment to conservation in the time ahead.
I believe we have just witnessed one of the most creative and one of the most productive eras in the history of the entire American Congress. Collectively, they have written a record that I think has never been matched in all of our 188 years, and I'm proud of it.
On Monday, January the 6th, President and Mrs. Johnson journeyed to the Longworth office building on Capitol Hill for a reception given in their honor by the House leadership. Here, surrounded by so many of his former colleagues from the House and the Senate, President Johnson paid a warm and nostalgic tribute to old friendships and a record legislative achievement.
They didn't make a confirmation I wanted. They didn't ratify a treaty when I wanted to. But they did their job. They did it as they saw it, and they did it well. And they did it better and this government than any other government in all the world, in my judgment. This Congress was my home for so long, and I love it so deeply
And I know how it does rise to the demands of our time, and I hope and pray it will continue to.
3 days later, as a cold, biting wind swept across the Capitol Mall, several hundred dignitaries and a handful of officials from the Smithsonian Institution joined President and Mrs. Johnson and Chief Justice Earl Warren to celebrate the giving of a unique and handsome gift to the city of Washington. On the dais was financier and art collector Joseph Hirshhorn. Born in Latvia and raised in the Jewish slums of Brooklyn, Hirshhorn had become a millionaire by the time he was 29. Now, 40 years later, he was witnessing the realization of his most persistent dream, the groundbreaking for the vast new Hirshhorn Museum that would house the $50 million art collection that he had given to the United States.
National culture, and his administration was the first to recognize the importance of art in American life and to legislate in its favor. It is an honor for me to give my art collection to the people of the United States. I think it is a small repayment for what this great nation has done for me and others who, like me, arrived here as immigrants. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you something else. We Americans are a great, wonderful, generous people. We are wonderful, and I'm glad to be proud of one of the members of this family. I came here as a little boy brought by my mother when I was 6 years old, that's 63 years ago, and I'm glad I'm here.
Today and tomorrow are memorable days for this capital and for this country. Tomorrow, we will greet here in Washington 3 voyagers who can describe for us sights that have never been seen before by human eyes. Today, we celebrate the enriching power of art and the spirit of creation. We honor a most remarkable man and a most magnificent gift. Each of the events that we commemorate in these 2 days, the flight of Apollo 8 and the birth of the Hirshhorn Museum, tells us something about this country and its people. We are in love with science, with progress, with change, with adventure, with technology. Our reach into space expresses that enthusiasm and that determination. We are restless, questing, deeply moved by art and symbols that are concerned with inner things.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
On December 21st, 1968, 3 American astronauts, on the strength of a Saturn V rocket, began man's most far-reaching voyage of exploration, his first flight around the moon. 3 days later, as they swept into lunar orbit, they looked back to see the Earth as it really is, a small, wet, spinning planet on the edge of an inconsiderable galaxy, floating in eternal silence.
There's little that hasn't been said or written in praise of these famous men who have come here to the East Room with us this morning. We are quite naturally proud that they are all Americans. But we recognize that mere national pride is insufficient. That these men represented in the vastness of space all mankind, all of its races, all of its nationalities, all of its religions, all of its ideologies. For 7 days, the earth and all who inhabit it knew a measure of unity through these brave men. Colonel Borman, Captain Lovell, Colonel Anders. You have been where no human being has ever ventured. You have seen firsthand what no human eye ever saw before you. Your flight was an unparalleled achievement of technology. Yet behind the sophisticated hardware of space, Apollo 8 was a story of men. There were those first men who dreamed of powered flight into space. There were those men in our government who 10 years ago fought to guarantee America's role in space. I'm glad that I was one of them. Our space program, and this, its most spectacular achievement, have taught us some very invaluable lessons. We have learned how men and nations may make common cause in most magnificent and hopeful enterprises of mankind. And this morning I renew America's commitment to the principle and to its enormous promise. If there is an ultimate truth to be learned from this historic flight, it may be this. There are few social or scientific or political problems which cannot be solved by men if they truly want to solve them together. I'm very proud to present you with the NASA Distinguished Service Medals. They're very small tokens of our appreciation for what you've done for our country and for the world and for us.
Mr. President, I thought that we had experienced every motion known to man in the 20 hours we spent in lunar orbit, but I must confess that I believe this just topped it. And I know I speak for Jim and Bill when I say we're three grateful Americans. Grateful to you personally. We recognize your interest and your contributions to the space program of our country, and we're grateful to this wonderful country. They've supported us in every way. And although we're symbolic of the country's greatness, we certainly feel very inadequate. And we're just very, very grateful. And sir, we did want to give you two things. We carried with us a space treaty around the moon, and Bill Anders would like to present that to you, sir. And Mr. President, Jim Lovell has a picture of the ranch I think he'd like to.
It was a ceremony without fanfare, and it was done with great care, with a meticulous mathematical precision. There were no reporters or correspondents there, only a handful of White House staffers who seemed to linger extra long outside the doorway to the office. Yet, to those who were present, the transfer of presidential desks was clearly an eloquent symbol of the shifting of presidential power, a moment which was now only a few days away. After a weekend stay at Camp David, President and Mrs. Johnson flew to New York City for a farewell dinner, which was being given in their honor at the Plaza Hotel. Hosted by 18 of the Johnson family's closest friends and attended by over 400 prominent guests from both political parties, the evening was truly a moment of gaiety and nostalgia. One of the highlights was a presentation by Governor Nelson Rockefeller of a capsule history of the Johnson presidency as written by 21 distinguished Americans.
We shared the dreams and the battles of a 5-year encounter with destiny. There will, in the years ahead, be many evaluations of all of the things that we did. But what really matters is not the ultimate judgment that historians are going to pass on the work that we've done and this period or even this administration. But what matters is whether there has really been a change for the better in the way human beings live in this country. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I really think there has been.
On Tuesday the 14th, President Johnson held his last formal meeting with the members of the congressional leadership. In a matter of hours, he was due to deliver his 6th and final State of the Union message in the House chamber. It was clearly a sentimental journey, but his decision to deliver the message in person had sent the historians among the journalistic fraternity back to their history books. They discovered that, as a presidential prerogative, it had not been invoked since the days of John Adams in 1801.
My distinguished colleagues of the Congress, I have the high privilege and the distinct honor, not only officially but personally to me, of presenting to you the President of the United States.
Speaker. Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, members of the Congress, and my fellow Americans. For the 6th and the last time, I present to the Congress my assessment of the State of the Union. I shall speak to you tonight about challenge and opportunity, and about the commitments that all of us have made together that will, if we carry them out, give America our best chance to achieve the kind of a great society that we all want. Every president lives not only with what is, but with what has been and what could be. Most of the great events in his presidency are part of a larger sequence extending back through several years and extending back through several other administrations. Urban unrest, poverty, pressures on welfare, education of our people, law enforcement and law and order, the continuing crisis in the Middle East, the conflict in Vietnam, the dangers of nuclear war, the great difficulties of dealing with the communist powers, all
have this much in common. They and their causes, the causes that gave rise to them, all of these have existed with us for many years. Several presidents have already sought to try to deal with them. One or more presidents will try to resolve them or try to contain them in the years that are ahead of us. But if the nation's problems are continuing, so are this great nation's assets. Our economy, the democratic system, our sense of exploration symbolized most recently by the wonderful flight of the Apollo 8 in which all Americans took great pride. And the good common sense and sound judgment of the American people and their essential love of justice.
The occasion was obviously an emotional one, and the message, low-key as it was, focused heavily on one word: commitment. The departure of one administration did not mean an end to the problems it had faced. The efforts to meet them had to go on year after year if the momentum that had been gained over the years wasn't to be lost. The very existence of promises like the anti-poverty program, the Model Cities Bill, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968 was a kind of reality in itself. Breaking those promises, especially those that had touched the lives of the poor, would be a tragic error.
But it is not fully completed, of course.
Greater revenues and reduced federal spending had changed the budgetary picture quite dramatically since the previous January. In the fiscal year ending on June 30th, the government would declare a $2.4 billion surplus, anticipating a year's extension of the 10% surtax. The budget for fiscal 1970 would provide a surplus of $3.4 billion.
It affirmed the historic goal of
The prospects for peace in Vietnam now seemed better than at any other time since the North Vietnamese invasion 4 years before.
And the free nations of Asia know what they were not sure of at that time, that America cares about their freedom, and it also cares about America's own vital interest in Asia and throughout the Pacific. And now, my friends in Congress, I want to conclude with a few very personal words to you. I rejected and then finally accepted the congressional leadership's invitation to come here to speak this farewell to you in person tonight. I did that for two reasons. One was philosophical. I wanted to give you my judgment as I saw it on some of the issues before our nation, as I view them before I leave. The other was just pure sentimental. Most of my life, most all of my life as a public official has been spent here in this building. For 38 years since I worked on that gallery as a doorkeeper in the House of Representatives, I have
I have known these halls, and I have known most of the men pretty well who walk them. I know the questions that you face. I know the conflicts that you endure. I know the ideals that you seek to serve. And now it's time to leave. I hope it may be said 100 years from now that by working together, we help to make our country more just. More just for all of its people, as well as to ensure and guarantee the blessings of liberty for all of our posterity. That's what I hope. But I believe that at least it will be said that we tried.
On the evening after the State of the Union message, President and Mrs. Johnson joined the members of the Diplomatic Corps at the Pan American Union as they paid a farewell tribute to Secretary Dean Rusk and his wife, Virginia. On Thursday morning, just prior to the formal signing of the economic message, and with little more than 3 days remaining to him as chief executive, President Johnson startled Washington with a sudden and dramatic announcement.
Last night and this morning, we have had certain decisions that please us. That we have learned that certain basic procedural problems in Paris have been solved, and that new talks on the substance of peace in Southeast Asia can now open. So this year, I think the impartial record will show that we have made steady progress toward the peace that we all devoutly pray for. And I deeply believe that if we can only remain united in the days ahead, and if we can stay together on this path, we will achieve an honorable peace in Southeast Asia at the earliest date that it is possible to do.
The breakthrough, which came after 10 agonizing weeks of diplomatic maneuvering, meant that talks could now get underway. It could also mean that one day, happily, ceremonies like the one in the East Room on the afternoon of the 16th would no longer be necessary.
For the final time during my presidency, this House is graced with the company of the heroes who have scaled heights known only to a very few men in this land. The courage of the bravest in war is a very rare and a very special quality. It knows no rank or station. Generals and privates have won the Medal of Honor. riflemen and sailors and pilots and priests have all worn it on their breasts. It has gone to every kind of man that our country has ever produced. They have come from the cities and the farms in every section of our land. They have lived in different times, and they have fought in different battles on different fields. They have demonstrated their bravery many, many times in different ways. But they have all shared one noble distinction. Each man heard the call of duty in an hour of hard challenge, and each man answered that call with a courage beyond demand. So now the names of Jackson and Pless and Lassen and Dix are added to this roster of the very brave, and the record of their deeds at the very summit of human testing will forever now be part of the history of valor. The words above and beyond the call of duty would never sound again in the world that we want and work for. Never again would war summons the best that men can give. But when that day comes, there will always be a high place of honor for the men who have bought it. For all the good and gallant fighting men who took their duty as they found it, and they discharged it always with the courage of giants.
A presidential inaugural is a moment balanced between the present and the future, when the nation waits for the voice of one man. But it is also a moment teeming with the memories of the past. For the men who had been closest to him and who had given the administration so much of its character and presence, their final meeting was a moment of tribute and laughter, touched with a sudden sense of loss and sadness.
This is the 80th cabinet meeting that I have had as president. The president's cabinet, his official family, he has a relationship with it not unlike his own family. They are, or should be, the closest counselors he has and the authorities in their respective fields, as well as his champion in every field.
For the members of the family, the hours seemed suddenly more precious. The moments spent in quiet and familiar rooms now became memories that will have to last for a lifetime. To some, of course, this moment in time was of little significance. One day, they'd be told how they spent their final hours here. A salute by the President's own, the United States Marine Band. On the morning of January 20th, Lyndon Baines Johnson began the final hours of his presidency. With the arrival of the president-elect at 10 a.m., both men would be caught up in a ceremonial timetable, a timetable that would, in effect, remove the burdens of office from the shoulders of one man and pass them on to the other. At 12:16 p.m., Richard Milhous Nixon became the 37th President of the United States.
Most people come into the office with great dreams,
and they leave it with many satisfactions and some disappointments, and always some of their dreams have not come true. And I'm no exception. But I'm so grateful and so proud that I've had my chance. And as to how successful we've been in doing the greatest good for the greatest number, the people themselves and their posterity must ultimately decide. I have the satisfaction, my family has the satisfaction, that we gave it all we had. And we think we provided some of the answers to the needs of our time.